Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the fifth episode of our Smart Sandyford webinar series. Here we look at smart city topics and explore how the use of tech-based solutions can enhance Sandyford and the wider Dublin region. For those of you watching live this morning, please feel free to use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen to ask our panelists any questions through the talk. Today, we'll be taking a closer look at sustainable travel and the real-world challenges in project development. Ongoing Smart Sandyford mobility projects include the development of a placemaking and mobility plan with the Sandyford bid, and our citizen science-based We Move traffic sensors with our partners in TCD Enable. It's fantastic to see the engagement and enthusiasm these projects receive, but that pales in comparison to the outpouring of support for the new 4-kilometre coastal mobility route Dún Laoghaire is receiving. The new route has had a real impact on the local towns and villages and has already proven hugely popular with local residents, commuters, and weekend visitors. To discuss this and other important aspects of sustainable transport in a smart city, I'm delighted to be joined by Cathaoirleach Una Parr and Director Robert Burns from Dún Laoghaire-Rathdown County Council. You're both very welcome, guys.
Thank you, Conor.
So, Councillor Parr, over to you first. Una is a Green Party councillor representing Killiney and Shankill. She previously worked as a strategic advisor to our local TD, Catherine Martin, and was recently elected by her fellow councillors as the Cathaoirleach or County Mayor. Una, could you tell us a little bit more about what sustainable transport means for Dún Laoghaire and your role in the council?
Yeah, well, I suppose, first of all, I'll speak to what the sustainable transport is. For me, it's very much focusing in on making everything accessible and improving just kind of like an independence of movement would be a big thing for me. And I think this is something that we've seen with the cycleway on the seafront, just how accessible it is to people of all ages. I've seen people who are, I've seen 3-year-olds on those like non-pedal bikes going along. I've seen Clara from Cycling Without Age doing with the trike that she has. I don't know if everybody here is familiar with it, but basically it's set up to be able to take 2 passengers on the seat at the front, and they work predominantly with people in sort of nursing homes and with mobility issues. And I think this is a way of just opening up our towns and villages, as you said. I know for me, I've probably traveled that coastline on bike more over the past 3 months now than I have in the, maybe year that preceded it. Just having that sort of openness. I think the sustainable fact of it comes from that this is something that, people can use as walkers, cyclists. I think that it's just, if you're able to do that, it can encourage people to buy a bike. It can encourage people to try walking. And that's something I've seen all over Twitter now, is people saying that they've bought a bike for the first time in 20 years, they're back on it. And it's true, you don't forget how to cycle it. And that's wonderful. And it's that infrastructure gives people the courage to engage in sustainable transport. And something I've seen as well, I think a big thing for our county will be the introduction of people buying electric bikes as well. Because particularly I know down my end of the county with the hill, it's not the most pleasant thing to come back up at the end of a day. So I see that having that infrastructure will encourage people to do that, to go out and buy that bike, make that investment. Even if it's, you're looking at, are we going to buy a second car, or are we going to buy an electric bike that can carry large cargo around the place? And when we have this infrastructure, it makes that possible. And then, yes, I'm a councillor as well. I suppose that's my role in things is, mix of oversight and representations to come to Robert at times with my various schemes that I've concocted along the way, but also to have oversight of how we develop our county. And we'll be doing that now over the forthcoming months with the county development plan. It does what it says on the tin, where we'll be making all those decisions on everything from transport to what our parks are like, our housing, our planning, everything. That's the role of a councillor. So we're sort of like a bit of an oversight and a directional board, I think is the best way of thinking about us.
That's brilliant. No, I think you've answered the question perfectly. It's all about accessibility and giving people those options. And if people are not having to buy a second car, that could be absolutely incredible. Thank you. Now over to Dún Laoghaire-Rathdown County Council Director Robert Burns. Robert is a trained engineer and the Director of Infrastructure, Sustainable Mobility and Climate Change. Having been appointed as a director in March, Robert had an immediate impact by developing and implementing the coastal mobility route that we've been talking about. Following the success of that project, he's already working on his next program to deliver e-vehicle infrastructure across the county. Robert, we're seeing a 100% increase in cyclists along the coastal route from last year. And on Sunday, 5,353, which is astounding, cyclists past Sea Point. This project has clearly had a massive impact. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about your role in planning that and implementing and what the plans are going forward.
Okay, well, yeah, it's proven to be quite a success, but it's not that surprising really. It has all the ingredients for it to be a success. It's in a good location in Dún Laoghaire. It's going between and along a number of our very important villages from Booterstown, Blackrock, Monkstown, Dún Laoghaire, Glasgow and Dalkey. So there's a lot of interesting places to visit. And more to the point, there's a lot of people who live there. So I think sometimes there is a focus on this as being an iconic sort of greenway when it really is a transport corridor. And I think I would like that focus to shift to that, because while we look at the 5,300 odd on Sunday, it carried 17,000 during that whole week. So that's bringing, allowing children to cycle to school, people to go to work, friends and families to meet up and socialize, and people to go for appointments. And really important when you look at transport, public transport being in difficulty, and the recommendations to only use for essential travel. So I think, so the project started in and around June. We were seeing 100% increase in cyclists along the coast. That's several 100% at this stage. So, massive increase. So, to put this into context, 17,000 a week now was compared to 13,000 a month. So that's well over double. And that was based on the 100% increase from May. So it was about 30,000 in May using it, compared to about 15,000, 16,000 in May last year. So there's a fourfold increase if you look at it from last year to this year on that route in terms of cycling. It doesn't even take into account the number of people who are walking. So we mustn't forget that. The cycleway in itself is creating actually a safer space for people to walk, because it's almost a buffer between traffic lanes moving at high speed with heavier vehicles. So there would have been a perception that it might have been a negative thing to have cyclists cycling along the coast and possible conflict with pedestrians, and that's completely not the case. Those vehicles are moving at very low speed, and that's really interesting because it isn't a high-speed route. It's very much a low-speed cycling route, 15, 20 kilometers at tops. So when we looked at this in June, we were looking at the increase in the number of cyclists along the coast. It was a cause for concern. We also had the issues with COVID and social or physical distancing. And we felt that this was the appropriate response to try and get us through COVID and to allow for transport along the coast. And I think it's fair to say that in a time of a pandemic, when people are afraid of being close to one another and the risk of infection, cycling is actually a very good mode of transport to have, because you can generally stay a distance of 1 to 2 meters apart while you're cycling, and you're doing it in the open air. And that doesn't even take account of the health benefits and the environmental benefits that come from that. Because what we are also seeing is that the impacts, the knock-on impacts are generally positive. We're seeing quieter streets. So people have less noise, we're seeing less fumes in the streets. And that's not to say that everything has been positive, because I'm sure there's quite a few people, maybe even residents, some businesses that aren't supportive of it. And we're dealing with those concerns as well. And in terms of our approach, what we used was an adaptive design and build model. So we trialed it. We're still trialing it, so we're still in the process of the trial. So we accept in that type of situation that we don't get everything right at the start, but it's much better to start and build what you need to build, get the key safety elements in place, the segregation from traffic, a clear route through, remove conflicts at junctions and so on. But we have been making changes as we go, and we continue to make that. And I think that's a new approach in Ireland generally. We haven't really used that experimental approach. And so it's worked out quite well. Interestingly, that was being proposed on the Strand Road route. The Dublin City Council were put forward, and I think we're all probably aware that that's been postponed. The trial has been postponed until the new year, I think at the earliest. So what we're doing here is having impacts elsewhere. Others are trying to adopt it. And we're actually looking at moving to a more sustainable model ourselves, where we incorporate this whole notion of trialing and getting things done. Because the reality is that if we wait to be convinced of all the possible changes and the possible impacts and try and understand all of them, we probably won't get started. And that's been our experience over the last 20 years with long public consultation processes, issues being raised that are not that easy to answer unless you actually have a trial and you understand what the impacts are. So I think there is scope for changing that. At the moment in our council, that's something we're trying to progress ourselves, but I think there may be a role nationally, something like this, and I would welcome something like a change in policy or legislation that would facilitate on a maybe at a national scale and give protection to public bodies that are implementing it, so that they can do this and then evaluate the results, because I think it will allow us to move to that sustainable transport model in a much quicker period of time.
Thank you. I think that actually leads nicely into our first question. Maybe Una, I'll go back to you. We hear a lot about how national and local government is improving cities. What are your plans to make Dún Laoghaire smarter? As Robert mentioned, what would you like to see happen?
Yeah, so actually, I was thinking about this again earlier, and one of the things that I'm quite excited for is that we're looking into trialing the Dublin version of the Dublin beta project down here in Dún Laoghaire-Rathdown. It's something that I've been speaking to our chief executive about, and it's something I know that my colleague Schaefer Fuelon in Blackrock is absolutely mad to implement. And basically, it's a way of like working outreach and engagement. We have this utility of the internet, and we should really be proactively using it. So for people who don't know what the Dublin Beta Project is, it's a way of people having kind of an online consultation and debate on potential sort of projects, and even to put in their own project ideas. So it's everything from like safe streets for schools, so school streets, so kind of like potentially trialing the traffic closure of school streets at peak times. It's things like the bike bunkers that we've seen go up around Dublin City Council. That's something I would personally love. I'm not going to say it's coming, but I would personally love to see more of that around Dún Laoghaire. And I think one of the other things that I want to do, and we're working on it at the moment as well, is to start mapping out some of the public realm, in particular for me, the seats. And I don't think people talk about seats that much as part of transport solutions, but we really have done a lot of work with the sort of placemaking aspect of the coastal mobility and the other mobility interventions, where we've put in benches and seats and kind of things that allow people to rest. And this is really important for people who have reduced mobility issues, because your ability to walk around and cycle around might not be that strong. And I know for a lot of people, just even leaving the house but not knowing where the next place they can stop is it's a big fear. So that's something I want us to do, is have that map on the internet for people to use, because those facilities are out there. And even in a kind of a real world trial of this, I walked around recently with my mother in Dún Laoghaire, and she had a surgery earlier in the year, so her mobility is still a little reduced, and just knowing where those spots were that we could go and sit, incredibly important. So I'd like to see that more mapping of that public realm, allowing people to know what's out there for them to use and to have confidence in going out and, you know, exploring the county or walking or cycling to work instead of using public transport or cars. You know, that kind of thing can be incredibly empowering for citizens. And I think, you know, when we have those tools at our disposal, that's something we should be looking into.
Definitely. Yeah, I think that we actually did a webinar on accessibility a couple of months ago, and that's exactly what they had said as well. It needs to be more inclusive, and you know, about 20% of people cannot use a bike, so just because of balance or they're frail or whatever. So absolutely, those people need to be included too. Robert, maybe you could tell us a little bit more about current and ongoing sustainable travel plans beyond the coastal route. What else do we have in the pipeline that we're going to see soon?
Yeah, well, I guess what's really interesting about where we are now is that possibly the policies and the plans that we had up until the end of February or early March may need to be actually adapted quite significantly because of what we're living with at the moment, because of the risk of pandemic and ongoing risk, and maybe something we'll have to live with for a number of years. So I think what it's pointing to is the need to be very adaptive. I think there's a government plan coming out today, I think, living with COVID, which is very timely, and I'm sure that's going to include elements to do with travel and transport. It's in terms of what we're doing, I think we should look at what has been in place as national and local policy for the last 20 years, and that's the sustainable transport model, which is about trying to put in place a modal shift, so getting more people walking and cycling and using public transport. So, I mean, it is stated policy, and this isn't just a philosophy or a particular point of view, that we do need to get more people out of cars, walking, getting them cycling, getting them into public transport. The future of our transport system depends on it, and the future indeed of our planet depends on it. So there's transport policies, there are climate action policies that this is very much a fundamental part of. We also know that the government has, there's legislation in place, I think, from 2030, moving to zero emission vehicles. So we're not going to have fossil fuel vehicles on our roads. We need to be ready for that transition. Electric vehicle charging is an important part of that. So it's important to put in place a network, a sustainable network for electric vehicle charge points. So in Dún Laoghaire-Rathdown County Council, we're working with the other Dublin local authorities in putting in place a strategy across the city, because what we have found, based on the experience in other jurisdictions, is that there is a need for that to be consistent, high quality and interoperable, such that if you're charging your car in Finglas, you should be able to just move through the city into Clondalkin or to Dalkey and plug it in and charge it in the same way, and have systems in place such as a back office and billing that allows people to use those facilities in a fairly seamless way. The experience across the water in the UK would inform us on that, where they have very fractured systems and multiple operators, that doesn't really lend itself to that transition. But you know, electric vehicles get you somewhere along the road, if you like, but electric vehicles still have the same mass and volume as a vehicle, a car that's running petrol or diesel, so it's still taking up the same pit space. So we still may have those issues to do with congestion. So modal shift is really important to deal with two elements, and that's the sustainability in terms of the vehicles that are being used, but also in terms of the public space and how best to use public space, because an electric vehicle will still take up road space and still will be driving around looking for parking spaces. So we need to be mindful of that. But I think the future is really about the integration of modes. And even in somewhere like Sandyford, for example, you can see that the critical next steps would be to integrate public transport with active mobility. So to facilitate, for example, bike sharing within Sandyford would be something that should be attainable. But that's probably not going to happen unless we have a decent and safe cycling infrastructure within that area. So just as an example. So the infrastructure is really important on any level. And I don't think we design a road system without knowing that you could get from the start of your journey to the end point and know that it was seamless in between. But we have a difficulty when it comes to cycling infrastructure because we have sections of cycling infrastructure for parts of the network, and then there isn't really anything that's as efficient. So people have to go on road or have to stop cycling. So we really need to look at that and provide a fully connected and safe cycling network. That will allow us to activate those active modes, particularly cycling. And then there is another piece, I think, where we need stronger integration with public transport. In a lot of ways, the public transport companies are very much different to the local authorities and public bodies. So if you look at this on the continent, if you look in the Netherlands or Denmark, you would see the public transport is very much integrated with the work of the local authorities. So you would see large-scale bike parking, for example, in railway stations in Europe. We don't seem to have that here, and something we need to move to on. Even something as simple as being able to carry your bike on a train or a tram. Trams, we're not even allowed to carry them on it. And that's when we have 50% capacity at the moment. So we really need to think carefully about it. There's a need for an integration. Maybe it's a role for national government, but maybe there's something more we can do ourselves at a local level, and that's to work more closely with public transport providers and, for example, electric vehicle charging operators to see what we can do. But in the end, and whether people like it or not, if we're talking about sustainable transport, we're talking about less cars on our roads and using some other form of transport to get around, because that's what's sustainable.
Brilliant. Yeah, I think that last and first mile, getting from maybe the Lewis and Sandyford is a big challenge, and certainly you could still have a 15-20 minute walk to your office that a bike could make a huge difference. I think you touched on it briefly, but we've seen a number of articles written about Dublin city centres hollowing out, it's empty. What has the impact of COVID been on mobility demands around the villages and the towns in Dún Laoghaire? Have people stayed local, or are they just staying at home? Or what has that impact been on demand for mobility in the local area?
Okay, well, we're still trying to establish what that demand is, or what patterns are emerging. But what's becoming quite clear is that the thousands of people that were commuting every day into the city from the suburbs, in particular our suburbs in let's say Dún Laoghaire-Rathdown, they're not doing that as much, or maybe not doing it at all. And what that means is that there are thousands more people who are in Blackrock or in Dalkey or in Dundrummer and Ballantyre. And even at basic level, they have probably 2 hours more in their day if they can work effectively from home and they're working remotely or using computer systems. So what is it they're doing with that time? And what we're seeing is, for example, it's having a very positive effect in terms of school travel, because the parents who are at home have more time to walk or cycle with their children to school. We're seeing a much calm situation at school gates across the county in the last few weeks, which is really heartening. And I think that's one of the effects of COVID and people being able to work from home. The other thing that's really positive, I think, is that it's having a positive economic impact. So those people who would have been in the city during the day, working, having their lunch there, having coffee, are actually at home. So if they're working near Blackrock, they're probably going down to the village where we've carried out the recent works, and where we're seeing cafes and restaurants opening up. I think in the last 2 weeks, I think 2 restaurants or cafes have opened up in Blackrock village. And for me, that's probably the future for some of our towns and villages, is probably on hospitality, restaurants, cafes. COVID has obviously had an impact on retail, and that's very severe. I think a lot of people have moved to online shopping, which is not a very positive thing. If it's going through some sort of big multinational company, fine. If local companies are able to transition online, and that's something I think we really need to work a lot harder on, to help local companies get an online presence, because I think they would have a nice mix then of the local and the online. And I think people would generally support a local business if they're online. So it's really a tale of 2 cities in a lot of ways. You have the city centre, which has given itself over to tourism, to transient workers, through the tech industry, to hotels, to Airbnb. And it's finding during COVID that there is a lack of people in there. There aren't people living in the city. So in some ways, pedestrianisation for me is actually an initiative that's coming from the business. They're driving it because, and I hate to use this terrible kind of impersonal term, footfall, because that's reducing people to economic units, but they don't have people. in there, and they don't have people living in there. And while it's nice to have a notion of a 15-minute city, you need the people living within 15 minutes of that element. And that's when you talk about 15 minutes, it's walking or cycling. So that's a nice aspiration, but a lot of the issues are to do with planning and land use. And unfortunately, the city there may be quite severe consequences for it because of that. On the other hand, for ourselves and Dún Laoghaire-Rathdown, I think actually we could benefit from this. We have sustainable villages and towns in our area. People are very supportive of it, and from what we see, they're very happy to stay within a couple of kilometres. So most schools are within 1 to 2 kilometres, particularly primary schools, so people should be able to walk and cycle. Most of the villages are. And I think what COVID also is showing is that over the last 6 months, people know their own community. They had to stay in it. And almost anyone you speak to now will say, well, look, I know my parks, I know my local beaches, I know my amenities, I know my local shopkeeper because I had to go down and shop there. And so something as simple as deciding to go to your local park, which is 2 kilometres away, rather than to driving 10 kilometres to another park even within the county. That's a very simple decision. But when you think about it, that's not a very sustainable way to do anything, because that means we need car parks in those parks areas to take people from an area where they can go and use their own local park. So I think the future is quite bright, I think, for Dún Laoghaire-Rathdown, based on what we're seeing to date. Can't get complacent about that. But I think this emphasizes the importance of active mobility in particular, because if people will stay in their own communities, if they are working from home, if their needs can be met within a short distance of their home, then walking and cycling becomes the premium mode. It should be something that we're trying to promote and to enable.
Fantastic. Una, did you have anything on that? I think Robert covered an awful lot of ground there.
I think he covered a lot of ground. Yeah, I suppose just one thing I've kind of noticed, and it ties into what Robert has said, is that with people working from home, that little chance to explore other ways of doing stuff and having that breathing space to what's the word? I can't think of the word right now, but to try out new things, trial new things has been incredibly important. And I think has made a huge impact, particularly in things like the school runs. We've really just seen an increase of students cycling and walking. And I think that was that bit of breathability that people had. I do think there is a lot of work to be done on urban density in parts of the city, but as Robert said, we have quite strong village communities around here, and actually quite closely linked at times as well. Your ability to cycle or walk or move between them is quite strong. So I think those are good things. I think something I've noticed though is that there is a very good sense of wanting to support your local businesses. And I'm somebody who, when I go into shops, I just chat away to the people when I go in there and see how they're doing. And I was speaking to one bookstore who actually have a very good online presence, and they were saying that people were just mad to support them and keep them going. And their worry now is what happens coming up to the Christmas run. Will they be overwhelmed with people trying to come in? So I suppose that's another thing we have to look at. And make sure that we've got that sort of steady and sustainable approach to overwhelmed businesses as well. And I think that's something that these mobility interventions are having a huge impact. And I know down in Glassstool, for instance, they really needed it down there, really needed those extended pavements, because we have got queues coming out from all of the shops all day long down there. I know one day I queued for about 15 minutes in the rain for a coffee, which is probably daft, but I did it nonetheless. But having that sort of extended breadth of the footpaths really made that actually possible. Whereas if you're crouched in and there's cars whizzing by and it's pollution-y, there's just not that to stick around. And I think to help the retail aspects as well, we need those streets that you want to stay on and you want to explore and you want to find what it has. And that's actually, I'll end on this, something somebody said to me was that having slowed down in their transport modes, that they've discovered so many different shops and restaurants that they didn't know about, because when they were in their car going around, they couldn't see them. They're just whizzing past them. Whereas when they're walking or cycling, they're able to stop off and be like, wow, look at that. That's a great place. So I think that's really important, and it's something that we need to encourage and support going forward. Yeah.
Brilliant. We have about 15 minutes left, so I'd actually just like to turn to some of the Q&A questions that are coming in, and thank you to everybody who's put those in so far. Just Richard, yeah, you can ask any questions you need in the Q&A and we'll answer it live. But just to go back to the start, Des has a question for Robert. How do you envision adaptive design and build model would work on a national scale, and what protections would public bodies need?
There is a template that we could follow, and they're called experimental traffic orders in the UK. And so there's legislation in place to allow, they have another term, they call them low traffic neighbourhoods. We've been floating the idea in DLR of safe and quiet streets, which is a similar idea. And that's, I guess, to give space back to local communities to stop traffic or high speed movement through their areas, and still allow them to enjoy it, and to allow permeability for walking and cycling. I guess it's beyond the scope of what we can do in Dún Laoghaire-Rathdown, really. I guess might be some provision in terms of bylaws, but that wouldn't be strong enough. I think it needs a national input. It needs a national initiative to put in place something like a piece of legislation that would say local authorities can, under certain rules or conditions, implement these trials, and you have to do X, Y, and Z. I think the concern is that if we don't trial, we'll be given all these particular issues and questions that we won't be able to answer when we're looking at something on paper. We really need to trial to understand, to inform even future decisions. And that's why something like the issues on the Strand Road are really important, because I think in a lot of ways it's been postponed because of concerns from residents on displacement or movement of vehicles into their villages, which, based on much of the research that there is internationally, doesn't actually happen. There's this concept of traffic evaporation, where people, if you design it properly and you design good, safe mobility infrastructure, then people will choose that safe mode and will move away from the vehicle, or will choose to avoid that journey in the car because they have another mode that they can use. So it's important that we're fully informed, that we educate ourselves on the effects of these changes, and that we're not dealing with things that are not established and where there isn't evidence in place. So trialing, experimental traffic orders, whatever you want to call it, would allow us to learn and to get things done at the same time, because we're way behind in terms of implementing mobility infrastructure, which is a key component to delivering sustainable transport within Ireland.
Yep. The next question follows on from that as well. Sustainable transport is itself not a sustainable development goal or SDG, but sustainable transport is an important component in achieving many of the SDGs. Are the transport improvements and public realm improvements in DLR being linked to the SDGs, and how is this being communicated?
For me, Colin?
For open, whoever.
Una, do you have any thoughts? I have some. Do you want
to? Perhaps if you go ahead, because you can talk to the planning aspect of it, and I might just come in after you then with a couple of other notes.
Okay. I think that might have come from Cynthia. So yeah, it's something we're looking at, Cynthia. I wouldn't have a full answer on it now, but yeah, there's a lot more at play than just sustainable transport. There is, in terms of sustainable development goals, there's more work we need to do on that. So rather than just give a vague answer on it, it's something that we're looking at and we're going to develop further.
Yeah, so from the council point of view, this is something that quite a few of the councillors are particularly concerned with, and it's something that we're interested in, particularly coming up to a corporate development plan as well. that we adhere to these roads or to these goals and make sure that they're built in. I know even if you look at some of the plans that have already come out, like the Ballyogan plan that was published a few years ago, there is thought to the SDGs in there. I suppose one of the things is that maybe we as councillors do have to be more aware of them and proactive on them, and all of them, because they're all of equal merit, and I think sometimes some are put forward before others. But one that I am going to touch on, because I do see in the chat that somebody's spoken about seeing more kids and women cycling, and what's not talked about often is the fact that there are like issues, gender issues in cycling and active transport. And I know that there's been great work done by a group in Ireland, I can't remember their name, but Janet Horner will be involved with them. And they focus on what are the issues for female cyclists, everything from just the scariness of cycling in some areas to the abuse that's hurled at some cyclists, and how do we overcome that? And even things like, I always think this is a very interesting example, not very applicable to Ireland so much, but in Sweden, they found that when they focused in on clearing the roads of snow and not the pavements of snow, that it actually proportionately negatively affected women who are predominantly walking. So there's all these kind of little things that you wouldn't think about, but when you gather the data, you can see and you can work on making sure that we overcome them. And I know that we are working to build up, like we have a study that will be ongoing on the impacts of the mobility interventions as well. We're working with a university on that. So again, we'll be able to pull the data from that and see where discrepancies are and where we're not reaching goals and where we are reaching goals and what we can do better.
Fantastic. Yeah, I think that's very well answered. I think we just have maybe 5 minutes, so, and we've a lot, the chat is hopping, so we might try and quickly go through some of these questions. How are we working with private companies who are in this space? And a number of the questions, just to clarify, are on kind of companies working with local companies, what the consultation process entails. So maybe we could talk about, this is a 6-month trial when we're talking about the coastal road. What will the consultation, will there be a consultation process at the end of that, or how will that work?
Okay, I'll maybe take this one. So, yeah, Una referenced it there. So we have engaged a university, it's Technological University Dublin, to do a full study of all of our public realm and mobility interventions. So they're working on that at the moment. And so they will have that study probably completed within 3 to 6 months. So the priority will be the coastal route plus Blackrock. What we're trying to do on that is to establish the impacts from traffic, mobility, social, economic, environmental, health. We're using as a basis similar indicators that they have in place, for example, in London for Healthy Streets initiatives, similar ones for livability within Denmark. And so we're looking at what's best practice around the world in terms of evaluating that. But there will also be user feedback. There'll be surveys of businesses, surveys of people on the route. And we're not looking just at the raw data of the number of users, for example, on the coastal route. We're looking at the profile of those users, which is really probably the most interesting part of it. Una mentioned it, is like that diversity of use on that route. So the numbers only tell you a part of the story. So once we have that done, the intention will be to go out to a public engagement process, get feedback from the public on essentially whether they want to keep these interventions or not. I think that's the decision point we'll have at that stage. But it could be something like to keep them, but with changes, or to carry out modifications. They're happy with certain elements, but they would like to see improvements or alterations along those lines. And I think there's a lot of talk about consultation, the lack of consultation, all of that. We have to remember we were in a public health crisis, and we still are in it. And we were given clear guidelines from the government back in May and June to implement measures, immediate measures, to safeguard the public health and safety of our citizens. And we did that in DLR. And I'm quite happy that we did it. I look around the country and I'm not so sure that it was implemented in the same way everywhere else. But we were following government guidance. And if you're in that kind of situation, then you don't have the luxury of a long consultation or engagement process, so you have to move relatively quickly. But I can say for our local authority, and Una would attest to it, that we've had very close engagement with our own councillors. I would meet with them. I probably met with them 8 or 9 times over the last number of months, give them briefings on what we're doing, answered queries and all of that. And that's a difficult position for the councillors. I understand that, because they have a very important role in terms of their mandate and the representation and oversight of what the executive, and I'm a member of the executive, what we're doing. So we're very important about keeping the primacy of the role of local democracy and making sure people do have their say. But as I said, we were in COVID-19. So now we're moving to another situation where we'll get the public involved. We'll have obviously the councillors involved as well. And hopefully that will rebalance that sense that there wasn't as much engagement earlier on, but later on there is. But the crucial point here, Conor, is that what we're engaging on is something that's already in place. People will have experienced it, they'll understand it, they know what these things look like, and they know what they feel like. Most of the time when we do engagement, it hasn't been built yet, and people are looking at what's already in place, and it's not really a fair comparison. I think this time it is a fair comparison because they have a memory of one that was there before, the 2-lane traffic on the coastal route, and this time they have the changes. So they can actually give, I suppose, an educated view, an informed view on in the engagement process.
Fantastic. I think we'll just take one more question here. So at the end there, from Anonymous, a lot of time and changes are presented as benefiting one group, cyclists versus motorists, over another, even if it benefits everyone. Have you found it hard to keep the narrative about collective benefits rather than one conflict between groups over road space?
Yeah.
I'm doing it.
Well, I think that I suppose it is difficult. It's a tricky one. I'm going to kind of break this down now, see how best to answer this. Well, I suppose something to touch on what Robert was saying about consultation. I do think the fact that we've trialed something and given some people something tangible to work with, it kind of allows us to more fully explore what something would be like, and we've kept very strong communications down our end of the county, as Robert said, with the councillors, and then when people come to us as councillors, we're there to relay information and take on concerns as well. And concerns have been taken on, and we're working with that, and we have changed aspects of the routes already, and particularly in relation to parking for people with disabilities. Whereas you look at some of the other interventions that are happening in other parts of the county, and they've kind of just evolved into a big kind of argument against cyclists versus motorists, and also a sort of a way of describing cyclists as a sort of an elitist group, which is interesting because when I moved to Dublin, my mode of transport was a €70 bike, and I paid €70 for it reluctantly, but it is what got me around to college and to work and saved me a pile of money, you know. So I think the best thing that we can do is keep on engaging with people, keep on working to show where there's positives. I think we've been lucky down here. We've got some really good activists in mobile transport as well, who've really come to the fore and helped to kind of get that story out and helped to get people to explore things. And I think, you know, we did well by getting these things in over the summer where people had time to try them out. And I think that's important. Like, I think as well, what I like to talk about is how I cycle, and I try to cycle and I try to walk so that those people who can't have the room for the other options. And I think that's something we have to speak about as well, where different members of the community take on different sort of, I don't want to say responsibilities, but approaches that allow people who are not able to take them on to use public transport or to use cars in the instance where they need to use cars. And I think that's something we've stuck strongly to down here. And I think it's something that we I think at a national level, there needs to be a discussion on that as well, how we do public consultation, how we keep things from becoming a huge fight, and instead focusing on how we can create something that works for people and that we can all have input into. But it's difficult. It's difficult. That's not an easy task at all. And I am from a nerdy public policy point of view, which is what I'm doing my master's in. I would be very interested for us to readdress how we do consultations in this country.
Absolutely. I think that's unfortunately all we have time for, but and there are a lot of questions we haven't got to, so I can only apologize for that. But I think we could almost do another webinar to keep talking about this. It's absolutely fantastic. In terms of the main points, I think what keeps coming up, despite us talking about transport and mobility, it's the priority of community and people coming together and working together. And I think looking at the answers you highlighted there, a lot of the measures and the consultation, all of this is a trial. We're looking at how to improve the city. And certainly the feedback from the other councils is Dún Laoghaire is one of the leading lights at the moment in how to do all of this, which is absolutely brilliant. So I can only say thank you so much to Una and Robert today. It's been absolutely brilliant chat. And I'd also like to thank our partners, Smart Dublin, Enable and Connect and Trinity, Sandyford Bid and Dún Laoghaire-Rathdown County Council. If anybody would like to follow up on those questions that we didn't get to, you can just email me and I'll get you an answer, no problem. Thank you all so much and talk to you soon. Good luck. Bye.